Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm well rested and I actually got to enjoy an old hobby this weekend. This is something I recommend every professional, advocate, or just enthusiast in the transit space partakes in. Let me explain. This Friday, feeling tired and stiff from a week of making a ton of videos, I decided to tackle a challenge I've been wanting to tackle for a really long time but just hadn't gotten around to yet. I wanted to walk the Yonge subway line in Toronto from its northern terminus at Finch Avenue all the way south to Toronto Union Station. This is among the busiest subway lines in North America, so I thought, hey, it's cool if I can walk the entire length of it that hundreds of thousands of people ride every day and see what I learn. Now, to be clear, I have walked the entire line in the past, but never in one go, and I think that the fact that it's in one go is kind of important. The longest individual section I had done before this was the section from Bloor-Yonge to North York Centre. Now, I will say about doing the Yonge subway in Toronto, it is uphill if you're going north, so the walk south was a little bit easier. So I took the bus to Finch subway station at the bus terminal. At 7:30 I started my walk, and I arrived at Union Station roughly 4 hours later at around 11:30 p.m. Now, to be clear, I did take a 15-minute dinner break and a 15-minute break to get snacks at Lawrence, but overall I think budgeting 4 hours to do a walk like this is reasonable, as long as you walk pretty quickly. Now, you can see some more of my pictures and opinions I had when I was doing the walk on the Twitter thread I made about the walk, which I'll link in the description below. But you're probably asking, quite naturally, why did you do this? The reasons I decided to walk the subway run deep, and I think there are a breadth of good reasons to do it. For one, especially when riding a subway, you can spend years taking the service every single day and never really understand what's happening above ground. And as someone who's curious about cities, I think that's a big thing you miss out on. I think it's very interesting how some of the best places in a city, and some of the worst places too, can be right under or below a transit line. I also think it's important that the hundreds of thousands of people making their way through these corridors every day sort of learn about the space that they should be invested in, given that they travel through it every single day. I also think that you learn from doing walks like this just how great the distances covered by rapid transit can be, and how smooth and seamless that unencumbered feeling of just traveling from station to station to station without really having to slow down feels. When you spend your whole life driving a car, or hey, even riding transit, 4 hours sounds like the time it would take to go from one city to the next. So the idea that it could take 4 hours to go from one place in a city to another and you're not even crossing the entire city, that's sort of out there. It opens your eyes to the scale, the massive scale of our cities, and I think it sort of can change your mind so you think about things a bit more locally. It makes your local neighborhood a lot more important because you think, hey, wow, other parts of the city are much further away from me than I may have initially thought. Of course, it also shows you how much work we have to do. Walking on Yonge Street above the subway, more or less, it's amazing how much of the street still ends up feeling like a highway, and just how car-oriented things are in a corridor that should be the most transit-oriented in the entire country. At the same time though, it's endearing to see how the pandemic-related complete streets, like rapid build-out, has changed the way parts of Yonge Street look in Toronto. Taking up some street space for some outdoor dining or for some more public space is really fantastic, especially in some of the vibrant neighborhoods served by rapid transit. Of course though, it does seem to a degree that some of the strongest measures are in places where you didn't really need to force cars not to be already. Though I am really happy to see the changes on Yonge Street north of the 401, where there is meant to be a major transformation of Yonge Street and where lanes have been taken away from cars to be converted into dining space primarily. It's really fantastic, and I was amazed how at 7:30 p.m. there were a ton of people out and about milling around and eating food at restaurants. Keeping that in mind though, I would say the current temporary feeling of the street-side cafes is not necessarily the greatest. The orange plastic cones with yellow tape do not really inspire confidence, especially when cars can still be flying past at 60 kilometers per hour. And so I think both making these spaces permanent as well as actually rethinking how the street operates is really important to making these spaces attractive in the long run. It can't just be about taking space away from cars. It has to be about rethinking how the space is used and providing alternatives so people don't need to drive. If If you just take away space from people who are driving, you're not actually solving their problems, and they're citizens too. Of course, something you might find interesting is that even though lanes had been taken away from the street, traffic was flowing fine. Why is that? Well, because we had this insane apparent need to provide parking directly adjacent to the curb. Incredibly valuable real estate that should not be used for cars to just sit there empty. There's tons of parking off-street in numerous locations in Toronto, and getting rid of street-side parking is something I would really like to see more of. Now, in the context of Yonge Street in North York in particular, making the street more appropriate for its use could mean reducing speed limits so that you're not sitting at a table with cars flying by you at high speed, as well as actually adding some buffer space so that people feel physically protected from vehicular traffic. Of course, this is especially hilarious because Yonge Street in North York literally has bypass roads to the east and to the west where people can drive around Yonge Street. So the obsession with keeping like 6 lanes of fast-flowing traffic there just makes no sense to me. Of course, some of the space on the street should also be dedicated to more people doing local trips and using transit. So cycle tracks towards the sidewalks, which should be widened because I imagine in the future we'll see more and more people walking around. Those sidewalks and that wider sidewalk also play double duty as more buffer space, so people walking on the sidewalk feel safer from traffic. Then you can also add bus lanes to provide faster bus trips and more capacity. That's an important point. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again, it is amazing how few buses operate on Yonge Street south of Highway 401, and that's something I think should change. It infuriates me when we say the Yonge subway is at capacity, and yet when you go above the Yonge subway, you don't see a ton of buses running even during peak periods. We have all this space on the street, the most important street in Toronto in my personal opinion, that we should use to provide active transport options and more bus options. If you have a city that has a rapid transit line that mainly runs along a single road corridor, you don't have to be New York with quad-track subways to provide a number of different levels of service. You can have a local bus. You can have a limited express that sort of stops at subway stations and then maybe the important intermediate roads, and then you can have a super express bus, which is maybe more like a coach or something like that, that stops at just the key interchanges. I think that sort of super express bus in Toronto's context could be operated by a GO bus. I know there's weird municipal rules about who operates bus services in different places, but such a route could be really valuable. It would be comfortable, you could have stops just at the major streets, and I think if you only had those stops and you provided bus lanes, which makes obvious sense on the most important street in the country, especially since there's tons of capacity, so people don't really have an excuse to drive if we provide good buses, you should provide bus lanes the entire length, and that way bus trips can be faster and more time competitive with the subway. And of course, providing that bus alternative means that some people who would have otherwise used the subway, well, they might use the buses. Some people don't necessarily like being underground, and some people would rather stay above ground and have internet access, for example. So providing alternatives is just a good all-around approach. Now, I did mention a number of transit-related and intellectual reasons for doing this, but those aren't the only reasons I go on these long walks. For one, walking is good exercise. It can be pretty low intensity, and if you have a good pair of shoes, you can walk for a really long time without getting tired, at least in my personal experience. Of course, as well, after a year of world-altering change, it's just great to be able to walk and reflect, as well as think about the future. And having fresh air is just really nice after sitting inside and working in a sort of a stale environment all day. All of that means that walking can be great for both your physical health and your mental health, and it's great to get out. It feels very refreshing, and just seeing people out and about is really relaxing, and of course you can get a snack and do something as well, so it's a great experience. It can be very spontaneous, and who knows what you see and what you might end up doing. Of course, walking can also give you a lot of street cred. It is amazing, and I saw this in my Twitter thread I made, how many people commented on it and said things like, "Oh, I've lived in Toronto for X number of years and I've never done that." Some people who are really prominent urbanists, for example. And I think what that goes to show you is that people often don't venture out of their little sort of enclaves in the city. And when you're talking about citywide issues like transit, having direct on-the-ground experience with different areas of the city makes you much more powerful in your discussions and your debates about different issues. In reality, things are often very different from what you see on Google Maps when you're actually on the ground and on the streets. You might see tons of people milling about, or it might turn out that things are really quiet and not super pleasant at night. I think that's part of why North York Center is one of my favorite neighborhoods in the city. There's so much pedestrian activity and there's a lot of good restaurants and the like, and while the street kind of sucks, at the same time there's more density and diversity of things to do in a short area than in much of the city. Despite that, it's often dismissed as a sort of subpar suburban center, and I think that's because not many people actually bothered to go walk around it. Now you might be wondering why I'm walking so late in the evening. 11:30? The truth is, I can't stand the heat in Toronto. Maybe literally and figuratively. It's pretty warm here even in the shade, unlike in Vancouver, because it is super humid all the time. And that miserably high humidity means it's not even that pleasant at night, but at least it's a little bit cooler. Of course, it's also more quiet, so you can sort of daydream and think to yourself while you're walking without bumping into a ton of people. It also means that the subway and the bus trip at the shoulders of this walk will be less busy, which I think makes transit much more pleasant. Now, I'll be honest, I've never felt unsafe walking at any wild hour of the day in most of our Canadian cities. If you are concerned about safety, bring a friend along, tell people where you're going, and maybe just try tracing your route by bus before you walk it. With all of that out of the way, I really just encourage people to get out into their cities and explore. Walk your tram lines, walk your bus lines, walk your LRT lines, walk your subway lines. Get out and walk and see what the streets are like when you're on foot, because I think that that's a great way to rediscover your city. You can see the problems that exist firsthand and you can share them with other people. If you get inspired to do that by this video, then I definitely recommend posting a thread on Twitter like I did, and feel free to @ me. I'd love to see what people get up to. And thanks for watching this video. I'll see you out on the streets.